World War II has just ended. America and its allies are celebrating victory. But two of America's most legendary generals are having a conversation that nobody else is paying attention to. MacArthur, who has spent decades in Asia, tells Patton that China will become the most important nation in the world within their lifetimes. Patton, fresh from defeating Nazi Germany, thinks MacArthur has lost his mind. What Patton says in response reveals why America would be caught unprepared for China's rise, why brilliant military minds can have massive blind spots, and why understanding geography and demographics sometimes matters more than understanding warfare. This conversation, largely forgotten by history, predicted the 21st century more accurately than any intelligence assessment of the time, and Patton's dismissive response represents exactly the kind of thinking that would cost America strategic advantage for the next 70 years. Two generals, two worlds. The meeting happens in the immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender. George Patton has just finished commanding American forces in the European theater, where he earned his reputation as one of the most aggressive and effective combat commanders in American history. His focus has been entirely European. He understands tank warfare, understands German military culture, and sees the Soviet Union as the next great threat. His worldview is thoroughly Western, shaped by European history and European conflicts. Douglas MacArthur has spent most of his career in the Pacific and Asia. He commanded American forces in the Philippines before World War II, led the island-hopping campaign that defeated Japan, and will soon become the supreme commander of occupied Japan. While Patton was fighting in France and Germany, MacArthur was learning to understand Asian cultures, Asian politics, and Asian strategic realities. His worldview encompasses civilizations and histories that Patton barely acknowledges exist. When these two men meet in the fall of 1945, they represent fundamentally different perspectives on what matters in the post-war world. Patton is concerned about Soviet expansion into Europe. He famously wants to rearm German units and immediately attack the Soviet Union before it consolidates power in Eastern Europe. His entire strategic focus is westward, toward the Atlantic and Europe. The Pacific, in his view, is a secondary theater now that Japan is defeated. Asia is something that European powers control and exploit, not something that matters on its own terms. MacArthur tries to explain to Patton that this European focus is dangerously myopic. He argues that China, with its 450 million people recovering from years of war, will determine the future of global power. He predicts that within a generation, China will industrialize, that Chinese nationalism will combine with communist ideology to create a force that Western powers cannot contain through traditional means. He warns that Asia's population, resources, and geography make it inevitably more important than Europe in the long run. American strategy, MacArthur insists, must shift focus to the Pacific and Asia, or risk losing the next great power competition. Patton's response, documented by several people present at various meetings, is dismissive and revealing. He essentially tells MacArthur that China is a backward nation of peasants that lacks the industrial capacity, political organization, or military capability to threaten Western dominance. He argues that the real fight is in Europe against the Soviets, and that worrying about China is a distraction from the actual strategic challenges America faces. Patton sees the world through a lens of industrial power and military technology, and by those measures, China appears irrelevant. What he doesn't see is that the world is changing in ways that his military experience hasn't prepared him to recognize. Patton's dismissal of MacArthur's warnings about China reveals a fascinating paradox. Brilliant military minds can have massive strategic blind spots. Patton is a tactical genius who understands armored warfare better than almost anyone alive. His aggressive leadership and innovative use of tanks helped win World War II. But his brilliance in European warfare doesn't translate into understanding the revolutionary changes happening in Asia. His expertise becomes a limitation because it makes him certain about things he doesn't actually understand. The problem is that Patton's entire frame of reference is European industrial warfare. He thinks about conflicts in terms of tank divisions, air superiority, industrial production capacity, and conventional military force. China has none of these things in 1945. Its industry is primitive, its military is fractured between nationalists and communists, and its infrastructure is devastated by years of Japanese occupation. By every metric Patton uses to evaluate military power, China is negligible. Therefore, in his mind, China cannot possibly become a major threat. His analytical framework blinds him to possibilities outside that framework. MacArthur's advantage is that he has spent years in Asia learning that Western frameworks don't always apply. He has seen how Asian cultures organize differently, how population size creates strategic advantages that technology cannot overcome, and how nationalist movements mobilize populations in ways that European-style military thinking doesn't account for. MacArthur understands that China's weakness in 1945 is temporary, that its massive population is an asset that will eventually be mobilized, and that Western powers are making a catastrophic mistake by treating Asia as peripheral to global strategy. The personal dynamic between Patton and MacArthur matters here. Both men are egotistical, confident in their own judgment, and accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. Neither is inclined to defer to the other's expertise. When MacArthur talks about Asian strategic realities, Patton hears the obsessions of someone who has spent too much time in a backwater theater and lost perspective on what really matters. When Patton dismisses China, MacArthur sees the arrogance of a European-focused general who doesn't understand that the world's center of gravity is shifting eastward. What makes this conversation historically significant is that Patton dies in December 1945, just months after these discussions. His views on China never evolve because he never lives to see China's communist revolution, never sees the Korean War, never witnesses China's industrialization or its emergence as a superpower. History freezes Patton's perspective at the moment of his greatest blind spot. MacArthur, who lives until 1964, watches his predictions about China come true, while Patton's certainty that China doesn't matter is proven catastrophically wrong. The contrast between their fates makes their 1945 conversation even more poignant. The vindication of MacArthur's warnings begins almost immediately. In 1949, just 4 years after his conversation with Patton, China's communist revolution succeeds. Mao Zedong proclaims the People's Republic of China, and suddenly the nation Patton dismissed as irrelevant has become communist, allied with the Soviet Union, and represents a fundamental shift in global power. The largest population on Earth is now under communist control, exactly as MacArthur predicted would change everything about Cold War strategy. The Korean War makes MacArthur's point even more dramatically. When North Korea invades South Korea in June 1950, American forces initially believe they're fighting a limited conflict against a small communist state. But when China intervenes with massive forces in November 1950, American troops are shocked by the scale and effectiveness of Chinese military power. The peasant army that Patton dismissed proves capable of fighting the world's most powerful military to a stalemate. American forces, equipped with superior technology and firepower, cannot defeat Chinese forces that use tactics and strategies that Western military thinking doesn't anticipate. MacArthur himself commands American forces in Korea and watches his predictions about China come true in the most brutal way possible. The Chinese intervention transforms the war from an easy victory into a grinding stalemate that costs over 36,000 American lives. MacArthur argues for expanding the war to attack China directly. But by then, political leaders are terrified of the strategic consequences of fighting China on Asian soil. The very scenario MacArthur warned about in 1945, where China becomes a power that America cannot easily defeat, has materialized exactly as he said it would. If Patton had lived to see the Korean War, his views on China would have been impossible to maintain. The tactical genius who thought Asian nations were irrelevant would have watched American forces struggle against Chinese armies using tactics that European warfare hadn't prepared anyone for. The industrial superiority Patton thought was decisive proves less important than China's willingness to accept massive casualties and its ability to mobilize millions of soldiers. Every assumption Patton made about China in 1945 is proven wrong by 1951. But Patton isn't alive to acknowledge the error. The long-term vindication of MacArthur's warnings extends far beyond Korea. China's industrialization through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s transforms it from a peasant economy into an industrial power exactly as MacArthur predicted. The economic reforms beginning in 1978 create the foundation for China's rise to become the world's second-largest economy. By the 21st century, China is America's primary strategic competitor, the center of global manufacturing, and arguably the most important nation in determining the future of global power. Everything MacArthur told Patton in 1945 has come true, while everything Patton dismissed as impossible has happened. The conversation between Patton and MacArthur in 1945 represents a larger pattern in American strategic thinking, a tendency to see the world through European and Atlantic lenses while underestimating Asia's importance. Patton's dismissal of China wasn't just one general's mistake. It reflected the consensus view of American strategic establishment. Most policymakers, military leaders, and intellectuals in 1945 believed Europe would remain the center of global competition and that Asia was peripheral. MacArthur was nearly alone in seeing that this assumption would prove disastrously wrong. The cost of this myopia was enormous. American strategy in the early Cold War focused resources and attention on Europe while treating Asia as a secondary concern. When Asian conflicts erupted in Korea and later Vietnam, American forces were unprepared for the type of warfare they faced. The military that Patton helped build was optimized for European-style conventional warfare, not for revolutionary conflicts in Asian terrain against enemies using tactics that didn't fit Western military doctrine. Thousands of American soldiers died learning lessons that MacArthur had tried to teach policymakers decades earlier. The economic costs proved even larger. While America focused on European recovery through the Marshall Plan, China was building the foundations of industrial power that would eventually challenge American economic dominance. By the time American leaders recognized that Asia was the center of global economic growth, China had already created advantages that would be difficult to overcome. The 40-year head start that MacArthur warned about became a reality because leaders like Patton couldn't imagine that Asian nations would matter more than European ones. The intellectual question is whether Patton's blind spot was inevitable or avoidable. In his defense, expecting anyone in 1945 to predict China's exact trajectory was asking a lot. The communist revolution wasn't complete. China's industrialization seemed impossible, and every contemporary indicator suggested European dominance would continue. Patton was wrong, but he was wrong in ways that most of his contemporaries were also wrong. MacArthur's prescience was exceptional because he saw patterns that almost nobody else recognized. But this is also why MacArthur's warnings matter so much. Strategic insight often comes from people with unusual perspectives who see what conventional thinking misses. MacArthur's years in Asia gave him knowledge that European-focused strategists lacked. His willingness to make predictions that seemed ridiculous to contemporaries shows the kind of vision that changes history. Patton's dismissal represents normal, conventional thinking that feels safe because it agrees with consensus. MacArthur's prophecy represents exceptional insight that gets dismissed because it challenges fundamental assumptions. History proved that in this case, the dismissed prophet was right, and the confident consensus was catastrophically wrong. What Patton said when MacArthur warned him China would change the world was essentially that MacArthur didn't understand modern warfare, that China was too backward to matter, and that focusing on Asia was a distraction from the real threats in Europe. This dismissal cost America decades of strategic advantage and represents a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming your expertise in one area translates to expertise in another. Patton was brilliant at what he knew, but he didn't know what he didn't know, and that blind spot shaped American strategy in ways that still matter today. The broader lesson is about how brilliant people make strategic errors. Patton wasn't stupid or lazy in his thinking about China. He was applying a framework that worked perfectly for European warfare, but failed completely when applied to Asian realities. His expertise became a trap because it made him certain about things outside his area of actual knowledge. This pattern repeats constantly in strategic thinking. Experts in one domain assume their expertise transfers to different domains and make confident predictions that prove wildly wrong. MacArthur's Vindication demonstrates the value of regional expertise and unconventional perspectives. His time in Asia gave him insights that Washington-based strategists lacked. His willingness to make predictions that seemed absurd to contemporaries shows the courage required for genuine strategic foresight. Not all unconventional predictions prove correct, but the ones that do often come from people like MacArthur who combine deep regional knowledge with willingness to challenge consensus thinking. For contemporary strategy, the Patton-MacArthur conversation about China remains relevant because we're still living with its consequences. China's rise to become America's primary competitor validates everything MacArthur said in 1945 and refutes everything Patton dismissed. The question now is whether current strategic thinking has blind spots similar to Patton's, whether we're dismissing warnings about emerging powers because they don't fit our frameworks, and whether we're making the same mistake of assuming that current realities will persist indefinitely. The ultimate irony is that Patton and MacArthur were both right about their areas of expertise. Patton understood European warfare better than almost anyone. MacArthur understood Asian strategic realities better than his contemporaries. But when they engaged with each other's specialties, Patton's confidence became blindness, while MacArthur's prophecy was dismissed as obsession. The lesson is that strategic wisdom requires knowing not just what you know, but also what you don't know, and listening to people who have expertise you lack even when their insights seem to contradict your worldview. What Patton said when MacArthur warned him China would change the world reveals the difference between tactical brilliance and strategic vision. Patton was one of the greatest combat commanders in American history, but his genius in European warfare didn't help him understand Asian geopolitics. MacArthur's decades in Asia gave him perspective that European-focused generals lacked, and his prediction that China would become the world's most important nation proved more accurate than anyone at the time could imagine. The tragedy is that Patton's dismissive response represented the consensus view that shaped American strategy for decades, while MacArthur's prophetic warnings were marginalized as the obsessions of an Asian-focused general who didn't understand what really mattered. History proves that sometimes the prophet everyone dismisses sees the future more clearly than the experts everyone trusts, and that brilliant minds can have blind spots large enough to miss the most important strategic shifts of their era. If you found this exploration of strategic vision, blind spots, and the predictions that proved right when nobody believed them valuable, consider subscribing for more stories about the conversations that shaped our world.